The underground is dead. At least that's what we're told constantly. The internet killed it. Algorithms killed it. Festivals got too big. Bands got too accessible. Everyone knows everything now. And apparently, somewhere along the way, the underground died. But here's the problem. I keep hearing about the underground. I keep finding underground bands. I keep finding tiny labels. I keep finding musicians recording in bedrooms, basements, garages, fucking storage units. I keep finding people putting out records that maybe 300 people will ever hear. I keep finding local shows where 30 people are packed into a room that absolutely was not designed to hold 30 people. I keep finding people trading tapes, sharing demos, running DIY labels, making zines, organizing shows, creating music that exists almost entirely outside the mainstream music industry. So, what exactly died? Because maybe the underground isn't dead. Maybe our definition of the underground is dead. And if that's true, then we have a much more interesting question. Who killed the underground? Before we start pointing fingers, though, I think we need to figure out what we're actually talking about. Because the underground sounds like a physical place, and it's not. There isn't a giant fucking door somewhere that says underground, members only. The underground is an idea. It's a collection of people, scenes, relationships, habits, and ways of creating and distributing music that exists outside, or at least partially outside, the mainstream machinery. And that's important. Because if that's what we're talking about, then the underground has never been one thing. It has always been changing. What counted as underground in 1985 wasn't the same thing that counted as underground in 1995. What counted as underground in 2005 wasn't the same thing that counted as underground in 2015. And what counts as underground in 2026 certainly isn't going to look exactly like any of those things. So when somebody says the underground isn't what it used to be, I actually believe them. They're probably right. It isn't. But that doesn't automatically mean it's dead. It may simply mean that the environment that created the old version no longer exists. Think about what underground traditionally meant. If you were a metal fan before the internet became the enormous, unavoidable thing that it is now, discovering music could be genuinely difficult. You might hear about a band from a friend, you might see a flyer, you might hear something playing in a record store and ask somebody behind the counter, what the fuck is this? And then they hand you an album, you buy it, you might hate it, maybe it changes your life. But the important thing is that discovery was constrained. There were fewer channels, fewer releases, fewer bands you could realistically encounter, and fewer opportunities to hear something from the other side of the world. And that limitation created something very important: scarcity. If only a few people knew about a particular band, knowing about that band meant something. If you had a demo that almost nobody had heard, that demo was had social value. If you found a weird record nobody else in your town knew about, you had something. You had knowledge. You had access. You had a connection. And that feeling became part of what people meant when they talked about the underground. You weren't simply consuming music. You were discovering something hidden. And then the internet absolutely changed that. There's no question. Suddenly, geography became less important. A band in Finland could upload music and have somebody in Missouri listening to it 5 minutes later. A band in Brazil could sell a shirt to somebody in Germany. A kid in a bedroom could discover a band from Sweden without ever stepping inside a record store. A demo that might have reached 50 people through physical tape trading could potentially reach 50,000 people online. And at first, this was fucking revolutionary, because suddenly you had the underground had something that it had never possessed before: reach. But reach creates a problem. If everyone can access the thing, can it still be underground? That's where the argument starts. I think blaming the internet is tempting. It's also incomplete, because the internet didn't just destroy barriers, it destroyed gatekeepers. And that distinction matters. Before the internet, there were people who controlled access to music: labels, distributors, record stores, and so on. These people weren't necessarily evil gatekeepers. They were simply part of the infrastructure. They determined to varying degrees what music traveled and where it traveled, who heard it. And the internet blew a giant fucking hole through that entire system. Suddenly, you didn't need permission. A band could record something, upload it, and put it in front of the world. That's one of the greatest democratizations, music has ever experienced. But there's a catch. When everybody can put something in front of the world, everybody's putting something in front of the fucking world. Now there's the problem that isn't access, it's attention. This might be one of the biggest changes in the history of music. The old underground had a scarcity problem. The modern underground has an abundance problem. There isn't too little music. There's too much. Think about how absurd that is. There are more bands than you could listen to in a lifetime, more albums, more demos, more bands you've never heard of, and will never have enough time to hear. So the problem isn't how do I find underground music? The problem is, how do I find the right underground music? That's a completely different problem. And I think this is where nostalgia starts fucking with us. Because when somebody says the underground was better when I was younger, they may actually be remembering something very real. But they may also be remembering what it felt like to discover something in the first place at the first time. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. If you're 15 years old and you discover a band that nobody you know has ever heard, that felt or feels enormous. It feels like you're discovering a secret. It feels like you've found something that belongs to you. Now, imagine doing something the same today. You discover a band, you search for them, their entire discography is on Spotify, their music videos are on YouTube, their lyrics are on Genius. Within 15 minutes, you've consumed more information about this supposedly obscure band than someone in 1994 might have ever been able to find in 6 months. That's completely different, absolutely. But is it worse? That's harder to answer. And then we have the algorithm. This is where people really like to point the finger. And honestly, I get why. Algorithms can absolutely influence what music people discover. They can flatten genres, they can encourage repetition, they can reward familiarity, and they can push music toward whatever keeps people clicking. And they can create these weird feedback loops where you keep getting served more of what you already demonstrated that you like. But here's the uncomfortable part. The algorithm didn't invent our desire for familiarity. Humans have always liked familiar things. Radio did it. Record stores did it. Magazines did it. The difference is that the algorithm can do it in an absolutely fucking enormous scale. It can look at millions of people's behavior and predict what they're likely to click on next. That's pretty powerful. And sometimes it's incredibly useful. I've discovered bands through recommendation systems that I never would have encountered otherwise. But there's also a downside. If your entire music discovery process becomes give me more of what I already like, eventually you're not exploring, you're reinforcing. And exploration has always been one of the defining characteristics of underground music. But because despite all of that, the underground keeps fucking appearing. Every year, new bands, new labels, new scenes, new sounds, new weird little movements that 5 years from now, somebody will insist were the greatest thing that ever happened to heavy metal. And most of them will never become famous. Most of them will never play a major festival, never have 1 million streams. Some of them will probably never make enough money, fuck me, from music to ever buy a decent fucking sandwich. And yet they exist. People listen. People show up. People buy records. And so if all that still exists, how can we honestly say the underground is dead? Maybe the mistake is assuming that the underground is defined by obscurity. Maybe it isn't. Maybe being underground isn't about how many people know you. Maybe it's about how the thing operates. A band can have 10,000 listeners and still function completely independently. A band can have 100,000 followers and still have no major label machine behind it. A band can sell thousands of records through its own label. A band can tour internationally without ever becoming culturally mainstream. So maybe popularity and underground status aren't opposites anymore. Maybe the old equation, small equals underground, just doesn't work anymore. Because the internet allows small things to become enormous without necessarily becoming mainstream in the traditional sense. That's weird. And I think we're still trying to figure out what it means. Here's where I think we finally get somewhere. Maybe the underground isn't a place. Maybe it's a behavior. Think about what underground culture has historically valued. DIY, independence, experimentation, community, resistance to commercial pressure, making something because you fucking want to make it, rather than because somebody in a bedroom decided there was a market for it. A boardroom, sorry, not a bedroom. If that's the definition, then the underground isn't dead. It's literally fucking everywhere. It's just harder to recognize. It's a band recording an album in somebody's basement. It's a person running a label out of their apartment. It's a promoter putting on a show in a tiny room. It's a teenager making music on a laptop. Or it's somebody pressing 50 tapes because that's all they can afford. Maybe it's a group of musicians building a scene because they don't give a shit whether anybody outside their city gives a shit. None of that requires obscurity. It requires independence and participation. But if the underground isn't defined by obscurity, we've created another uncomfortable question. Can something be underground if everyone can find it? And I don't think there's an easy answer, because part of what made underground culture powerful was the feeling of discovery, the feeling that you'd found something hidden. The modern internet makes hiddenness much harder. Search for almost anything, and you'll probably find it. But maybe that's not necessarily at a loss. Maybe the underground no longer has to hide. Maybe it simply has to exist outside the dominant system. And that's a much more complicated definition. So maybe the question isn't, did the internet kill the underground? Maybe the better question is, what did the old underground give us that the new one doesn't? And honestly, I think the answer is friction. It used to take work to discover things. You had to ask somebody, you had to trade, you had to dig, take chances. And because discovery required effort, discovery felt meaningful. Today, the friction's gone. That's convenient. But convenience has a strange side effect. It can make incredible things feel disposable. When you can access 10,000 albums instantly, one more album can feel like nothing. When you can discover another band with one click, discovery itself becomes less memorable. So maybe what we actually miss isn't the underground. Maybe we miss that feeling of searching for it. And here's the funniest part. The same technology that supposedly killed the underground may actually have created more underground music than we've ever had. There may be more independent musicians making strange, uncompromising music right now than at any previous point in history. There may be more ways for those musicians to distribute that music, more ways to find audiences, communicate, collaborate, build scenes. The problem is we can't possibly pay attention to all of it. So the underground didn't disappear. It became fucking enormous. And maybe that's why it feels invisible. Maybe, I don't know. We've blamed the internet, streaming, social media, algorithms, even the fans. But I'm starting to think nobody killed it. We just changed the environment in which it lives. The underground that existed 20, 30, 40 years ago was built for a world of scarcity. Scarce information, scarce music, scarce distribution, access. Today's underground exists in a world of abundance. Infinite music, infinite access, information, competition for attention. So naturally, it behaves differently. And maybe we've been making the same mistake we make with genre. We've created a definition and then become angry when reality refuses to stay inside of it. I'm tongue-tied as shit today. But I don't want to end this by pretending everything's fine, because there is a genuine threat to underground music, and I don't think that it's Spotify or YouTube or TikTok or algorithms. I think the real threat is passivity. The underground requires participation. Somebody has to start the band. Somebody has to organize the show. Somebody has to show up. Somebody has to give a shit. You can have the greatest underground music scene in the history of civilization, but if nobody participates, nobody shows up, it doesn't exist. That's the part I think we sometimes forget. We talk about the underground like it's something that exists independently of us. It doesn't. We're the underground. And that changes the question completely. If the underground is dead, then maybe we aren't mourning a place. Maybe we're mourning a version of ourselves. The version of ourselves that discovered music differently. The version of ourselves that traded tapes, spent hours in record stores. And there's nothing wrong with missing that. I miss things too. But nostalgia can become dangerous when we confuse I miss how that felt with this was objectively better, because those are not the same statement. The old underground had things that the modern underground doesn't. Absolutely. But the modern underground has things the old underground could never have imagined. A teenager with a laptop can create music and put it on in front of an entire planet. A band from a tiny town can find listeners on the other side of the world. A scene can communicate across continents instantly. Independent artists can distribute their music without waiting for somebody else's permission. That's not the death of the underground. That's a completely different underground. So, who killed the underground? Nobody. The underground didn't die. The world around us just changed it. And maybe the biggest mistake we can make is expecting a culture built under completely different technological and social conditions to look exactly the same forever. The underground isn't necessarily a hidden room. It isn't necessarily a tape passed secretly between 5 people. And it isn't necessarily a band nobody's ever heard of. It might be a basement show, a Bandcamp page, a tiny Discord server. It might be a person pressing 20 records by hand. It might be a musician making something that doesn't fit any algorithm's idea of what people are supposed to want. It might even be a crowd of 20 people screaming along to a band that will never become remotely famous. And realizing, holy shit, nobody else I know has or ever will hear this. And maybe that's enough. I think we've spent a lot of time asking whether the underground is dead. Maybe we should spend more time asking whether we're still willing to participate in it. Because if we want underground music to exist, we can't just consume it. We have to support it, go to the show, buy the record, tell your friends, follow the band, and maybe occasionally dig for something instead of waiting for an algorithm to fucking hand it to you. Because maybe that's what the underground has always been. Not a place, not a genre, not a number of listeners, not a certain kind of record. A willingness to look where everyone else isn't looking. And if that's true, the underground isn't dead. It's waiting for us to participate. But that's what I think. Do you agree? Is the underground genuinely dying? Has the internet destroyed something that can never be recovered? Or are we simply looking for the old underground in a world that has created an entirely different one? And if you think the underground is alive, tell me where you think it lives now. I want names, bands, scenes, labels, venues, whatever you think still represents the underground, because if we're gonna say it's alive, let's fucking prove it. If you've enjoyed this episode, hit the like button, subscribe to Negative Frequencies, and stick around for the final stretch of season 1. We spent all of this season talking about genres, authenticity, identity, perception, fear, heaviness, and the culture surrounding the music that we love. And we're not done yet, because the deeper we dig into heavy music, the more it seems like we're actually digging into ourselves. This is Negative Frequencies. I'll catch you in the next one.